Hello and welcome to another episode of Reading Together from Sea Harp Press. I'm Eugene Luning, co-founder of Sea Harp, and today we'll be continuing our journey through C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity. We are now in the fourth and final book of this classic work, and today in this episode we're going to be reading through chapter 7 of book 4, which is entitled Let's Pretend. And I just looked ahead, and this is a little bit of a longer chapter, so get comfortable. May I once again start by putting two pictures, or two stories rather, into your minds? One is the story you have all read called Beauty and the Beast. The girl, you remember, had to marry a monster for some reason, and she did. She kissed it as if it were a man. And then, much to her relief, it really turned into a man and all went well. The other story is about someone who had to wear a mask which made him look much nicer than he really was. He had to wear it for years. And when he took it off, he found his own face had grown to fit it. He was now really beautiful. What had begun as disguise had become a reality. I think both these stories may, in a fanciful way of course, help to illustrate what I have to say in this chapter. Up till now, I have been trying to describe facts, what God is and what he has done. Now, I want to talk about practice. What do we do next? What difference does all this theology make? It can start making a difference tonight. If you are interested enough to have read thus far, you were probably interested enough to make a shot at saying your prayers. And whatever else you say, you will probably say the Lord's Prayer. And one thing I'll say before we go on, one of the things that I absolutely delight in as I look at the life of Jesus is that everything that he asks of us is something where he desires to give us the power to do. So as he calls for obediences that seem at times impossible or so far outside of our natural human nature that we want to give up, well, right back of that, he's standing there saying, I'll give you the power. I will be the animating force behind that obedience. So I love that Lewis is now kind of bridging from the theological conversation into the pragmatic, because my reminder to you is that all theology is really pragmatism in the way of Jesus. Because the only way to understand theologically what we're to do is to pragmatically do the things he's asked us to do. So the day by day becomes the actual practice of living out the theology. There is no divorce between the two. You have to do things. I'll keep reading. Its, meaning the Lord's prayers, very first words are, Our Father. Do you now see what those words mean? They mean, quite frankly, that you are putting yourself in the place of a son of God. To put it bluntly, you are dressing up as Christ. If you like, you are pretending. Because, of course, the moment you realize what the words mean, you realize that you are not a son of God. You are not a being like the Son of God, whose will and interests are at one with those of the Father. You are a bundle of self-centered fears, hopes, greeds, jealousies, and self-conceit, all doomed to death. So that in a way, this dressing up as Christ is a piece of outrageous cheek. But the odd thing is that he has ordered us to do it. And I'll push a big pause right there and remind you, friends, that when Jesus' friends came to him and said, Lord, teach us to pray, just as the teachers of the law teach their disciples to pray, he looks at them, I have to imagine, smiling and says, pray like this. Our Father. And in that split second, what Lewis just pointed out to us, he has torn down the barriers between God and man and God for all time. Because pay attention to the actual word used first. Our Father. One of my dear friends, Matt, he always expresses it by doing this. Our Father. Our Father. Jesus' desire to be an elder brother to a bunch of fools and idiots like us is one of the greatest parts of the gospel. The fact that he says to us, no, 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 no. I know what you've been, but I will make you like unto me. In fact, listen again, our Father. It's Jesus who not only commanded us to pray that way, but did everything necessary to make it so. I'll keep reading. Why? Meaning, why did he order us to pray this way? What is the good of pretending to be what you are not? Well, even on the human level, you know, there are two kinds of pretending. There is a bad kind, where the pretense is there instead of the real thing, as when a man pretends he is going to help you instead of really helping you. But there is also a good kind, where the pretense leads up to the real thing. When you are not feeling particularly friendly, but know you ought to be, the best thing you can do very often is to put on a friendly manner and behave as if you are a nicer person than you actually are. And in a few minutes, as we have all noticed, you will be really feeling friendlier than you were. Very often, the only way to get equality in reality is to start behaving as if you had it already. That is why children's games are so important. They are always pretending to be grown-ups, playing soldiers, playing shop. But all the time, they are hardening their muscles and sharpening their wits so that the pretense of being grown up helps them to grow up in earnest. Friends, I'm going to give you a practicality around this very idea, not only of children playing, but of you and I needing to do that kind of grown-up pretend that we sometimes just need to do. Because in the Spirit of Jesus, knowing that we have his Holy Spirit, who is actually going to be like a motive force from within us, here's the practical. Sometimes you should just smile. This happens sometimes to me. I'll be on my way to a meeting that I do not want to go to. I will be preparing to give a talk when I just am not in the spirit of the thing. But I remember that in me is the actual Spirit of Jesus. And yeah, I maybe have kind of tamped the Holy Spirit down by my disobediences, by my bad attitude. But sometimes when I'm on my way to give that talk or going to that meeting I don't feel like going, I'll just do this. Yes, Jesus. Because he is with me. Because he is, again, the animating power behind my life. And so, like Lewis is talking about a good pretend, sometimes I just need to actually smile. Be reminded, even in the middle of a bad day, that I have the God of the universe with me and who can be against me. Because sometimes even that action of smiling, moving into that friendliness that is called of us, even when we don't feel it, sometimes that change is actually a change of atmosphere here and here. Try it. Think about it. Remember this little episode conversation the next time you sure don't feel like it. Now I'll keep reading. Now, the moment you realize, here I am, dressing up as Christ, it is extremely likely that you will see at once some way in which at that very moment the pretense could be made less of a pretense and more of a reality. You will find several things going on in your mind which would not be going on there if you were really a son of God. Well, stop them. Or you may realize that instead of saying your prayers, you ought to be downstairs writing a letter or helping your wife to wash up. Well, go and do it. You see what is happening. The Christ himself, the Son of God who is man just like you and God just like his Father, is actually at your side and is already at that moment beginning to turn your pretense into a reality. This is not merely a fancy way of saying that your conscience is telling you what to do. If you simply ask your conscience, you get one result. If you remember that you are dressing up as Christ, you get a different one. There are lots of things which your conscience might not call definitely wrong, especially things in your mind, but which you will see at once you cannot go on doing if you are seriously trying to be like Christ. For you are no longer thinking simply about right and wrong. You are trying to catch the good infection from a person. It is more like painting a portrait than like obeying a set of rules. And the odd thing is that while in one way it is much harder than keeping rules, in another way it is far easier. And friends, I'll stop and say, do you know why? Because the portrait we're trying to paint is alive. We don't follow a static or nebulous or mysterious God who is so removed from us that we have no conception of what he would be like in, say, a social setting, an office, picking up your kids at school, as I often talk about. Friends, we are trying to kind of paint by number the face of Jesus, but we're not trying to just get it out here where it's just a theological orthodoxy. We're trying to get it here and here. So it's so helpful, and I love that he says it. It's much harder, but sort of much easier. Because what we actually know at least some of is ourselves. We're well aware of all our foibles. We, of course, have blind spots, but as we go through the day, we're fairly aware that we just sort of lied, or that we had a lustful thought about someone else, or that we just kind of overly exaggerated our own sense of importance. We're kind of aware of these things, but you know what? Rather than getting down into a place of guilt and shame, we look at him, and we remember that he smiles upon us, that he's in fact died already to finish those things within us, and we say, Jesus, that didn't look like you. That didn't sound like you. That didn't feel like you. Would you forgive me again? And friends, on the other side, like right here on the other side of that prayer of confession, it's him, the portrait. And the portrait is alive and is saying to us, yes, I do forgive you. Now let's turn, let's repent again, and let's walk it in my way. And there we go. We've begun again. And I've said this to you before. That is not cheap grace, like my friend Bonhoeffer once called it. That is grace. That's the nature of making use of it so that we become actually helpful, fruitful parts of the kingdom of heaven. Let's not forget it. I'll keep reading. The real Son of God is at your side. He is beginning to turn you into the same kind of thing as himself. He is beginning, so to speak, to inject his kind of life and thought, his zoe, that's like the Greek word for the higher life, into you, beginning to turn the tin soldier into a live man. The part of you that does not like it is the part that is still tin. Some of you may feel that this is very unlike your own experience. You may say, I've never had the sense of being helped by an invisible Christ, but I often have been helped by other human beings. That is rather like the woman in the First War who said that if there were a bread shortage, it would not bother her house because they always ate toast. If there is no bread, there will be no toast. If there were no help from Christ, there would be no help from other human beings. He works on us in all sorts of ways, not only through what we think our religious life. He works through nature, through our own bodies, through books, sometimes through experiences which seem at the time anti-Christian. When a young man who has been going to church in a routine way honestly realizes that he does not believe in Christianity and stops going, provided he does it for honesty's sake and not just to annoy his parents, the Spirit of Christ is probably nearer to him than it ever was before. But above all, he works on us through each other. And I'll just pause for a moment there, because I have a great number of atheist and agnostic friends, and I often think, and this is very contrary to where people think about this in the church today, I often think that when people are, quote, deconstructing their faith, quote unquote, that what they're actually doing is beginning to think logically, but also in a sort of spiritual way, realistically in the direction of Jesus. Because a lot of our traditionalisms in the church are a little bit absurd and have attained to a sort of power that they need not have in our lives. Yes, we need to gather as the body. Yes, there are ways and means in which we do it. Sacraments we enjoy because Jesus enjoined us to actually enjoy those sacrifices, sacraments, etc. But sometimes when we start to actually think about what we believe, as Lewis says, we are closer to the Spirit of Jesus than we were before, when we were simply going through the motions in a Pharisaistic kind of way. So if you have, let's call them atheist or agnostic friends, don't give up. And also, don't argue so much. Just show them by your alive experience of Jesus that it is life. That what they're doing, fumbling around in the dark, looking for answers, is really just the fumbling around in the dark looking for him. If you have found him, you can help them. But if you have not found him, well then you don't have any arguments. All you have is your pat little orthodoxies and theologies that have been told to you. Those are what I would call received ideas. Friends, know Jesus. That's the only way to make him known. A little aside from your old friend Eugene. I'll get back to it. Men are mirrors or carriers of Christ to other men. That's kind of what I was just saying. Sometimes unconscious carriers. This good infection can be carried by those who have not got it themselves. People who were not Christians themselves helped me to Christianity. But usually it is those who know him that bring him to others. That is why the church, the whole body of Christians showing him to one another, is so important. You might say that when two Christians are following Christ together, there is not twice as much Christianity as when they are apart, but 16 times as much. But do not forget this. At first, it is natural for a baby to take its mother's milk without knowing its mother. It is equally natural for us to see the man who helps us without seeing Christ behind him. But we must not remain babies. We must go on to recognize the real giver. It is madness not to. Because if we do not, we shall be relying on human beings, and that is going to let us down. The best of them will make mistakes. All of them will die. We must be thankful to all the people who have helped us. We must honor them and love them, but never, never pin your whole faith on any human being, not if he is the best and wisest in the whole world. There are lots of nice things you can do with sand, but do not try building a house on it. That's such an important word for us. And I really want to say this clearly as we get towards the end of Mere Christianity, arguably the most famous of C.S. Lewis's books. I meet lots of very, let's call them evangelical or reformed or very Protestant, occasionally Roman Catholic friends who put a lot of faith in Lewis. And I love Lewis. But let's never forget that if you're reading more Lewis than you're reading the Gospels, you're on the wrong track. Or let's not make it Lewis. Let's make it some megachurch pastor that you happen to like watching their pastoral videos week by week. Well, don't put too much faith in them. Pay attention to the way that they're trying to imitate Jesus. But if they're not, and if they're trying to get a lot of the interest and attention on themselves, maybe look elsewhere, back to Jesus. Or maybe it's your own pastor. Maybe you're sitting in those pews every Sunday and really thinking that that man or woman up front really knows how to do it. So I'm just going to do what they do all the time and not really think about Jesus for myself. Don't do that either. Friends, human beings are going to let you down. Just watch the news for a few months and see some other big Christian figure that takes a big fall. Well, it's because we've done it to them. We've put them up on the pedestal. Then they started believing the lie about themselves, and of course they fell. Each one of us is following Jesus, only him. And as we let him be the head and all of us be the neck down, well, then the body starts to actually look right, equal, each pulling their own weight, each rejoicing in Jesus for themselves, and then coming each Sunday with testimony to give. That's how it's supposed to work. I'll keep reading. And now we begin to see what it is that the New Testament is always talking about. It talks about Christians being born again. It talks about them putting on Christ, about Christ being formed in us, about our coming to have the mind of Christ, which is one of my favorite promises. That's from 1 Corinthians 2, I believe, right at the end of that chapter. Put right out of your head the idea that these are only fancy ways of saying that Christians are to read what Christ said and try to carry it out. as a man may read what Plato or Marx said and try to carry it out. They mean something much more than that. They mean that a real person, Christ, here and now, in that very room where you are saying your prayers, is doing things to you. It is not a question of a good man who died 2,000 years ago. It is a living man, still as much a man as you, and still as much a God as he was when he created the world, really coming and interfering with your very self, killing the old natural self in you and replacing it with with the kind of self he has. At first, only for moments, then for longer periods. Finally, if all goes well, turning you permanently into a different sort of thing, into a new little Christ, a being which in its own small way has the same kind of life as God, which shares in his power joy, knowledge, and eternity. And soon we make two other discoveries. And I'm going to pause there before we read those discoveries because, friends, look right there. I dog-eared that page for myself because after I finish recording, I am going to sit and meditate on the paragraph in the HarperCollins edition at the end of page 191, just to bring you back into it. I love this. Oh, this is so good. It is not a question of a good man who died 2,000 years ago. Friends, how often do we act like it is? That we are arguing and doing our apologeticizing about Jesus as if it's a historical fact that has nothing to do with today. Friends, let's never do that. It's not a matter of a man who died 2,000 years ago. It is a living man, still as much a man as you, and still as much God as he was when he created the world. And friends, listen to this last clause of that sentence. Really coming and interfering with your very self. I think that's my takeaway from this chapter. If Jesus is not interfering with yourself, with your schedule, with your prides, with your career, with the way you're raising your family, if he is not interfering all the time, then you're acting like he's not alive. But you and I believe he is. So his interferences, the way that he interrupts our self-importances, the way we're going through our weeks without thinking about him, the way he interferes with us is life. It's eternal life, breaking through into this silly temporal one and showing us that though someday we will die and be gone here in this fleshly sense, we will live forever with him. Friends, let's pay attention to the interferences. Let's never stop looking for them. So good. All right, I'm going to keep going. He just said, and soon we make two other discoveries. So here's the first one. We begin to notice, besides our particular sinful acts, our sinfulness, begin to be alarmed not only about what we do, but about what we are. This may sound rather difficult, so I will try to make it clear from my own case. When I come to my evening prayers and try to reckon up the sins of the day, 9 times out of 10, the most obvious one is some sin against charity. I have sulked or snapped or sneered or snubbed or stormed. That's some good sibilance, if you will. And the excuse that immediately springs to my mind is that the provocation was so sudden and unexpected. I was caught off guard. I had not time to collect myself. Now, that may be an extenuating circumstance as regards those particular acts. They would obviously be worse if they had been deliberate and premeditated. On the other hand, surely what a man does when he has taken off his guard is the best evidence for what sort of man he is. Surely what pops out before the man has time to put on a disguise is the truth. If there are rats in a cellar, you are most likely to see them if you go in very suddenly. But the suddenness does not create the rats. It only prevents them from hiding. In the same way, the suddenness of the provocation does not make me an ill-tempered man. It only shows me what an ill-tempered man I am. The rats are always there in the cellar, but if you go in shouting and noisily, they will have taken cover before you switch on the light. Apparently, the rats of resentment and vindictiveness are always there in the cellar of my soul. Now that cellar is out of reach of my conscious will. I can, to some extent, control my acts. I have no direct control over my temperament. And if, as I said before, what we are matters even more than what we do, if indeed what we do matters chiefly as evidence of what we are, then it follows that the change which I most need to undergo is a change that my own direct, voluntary efforts cannot bring about. And this applies to my good actions too. How many of them were done for the right motive? How many for fear of public opinion or a desire to show off? How many from a sort of obstinacy or sense of superiority, which in different circumstances might equally have led to some very bad act? But I cannot, by direct moral effort, give myself new motives. After the first few steps in the Christian life, we realize that everything which really needs to be done in our souls can be done only by God. And that brings us to something which has been very misleading in my language up till now, which is about to be the second discovery, but I'm going to pause. And I just want to remind you that as he talked about at the beginning, that man who had the mask, and he wasn't a very friendly man, but that mask making him look friendly, making him look different than he really was, over time began to change him. I do want to remind you, a little bit contrary to what Lewis just said, that indeed it is by our concrete acts of obedience to the way of God, to the way of Jesus, that we do actually get down into the cellar of our temperament. We actually can have some effect upon the motives within us because we have set our face to follow the will, the way of Jesus. So if each morning you read in the Gospels and look for one thing that the Holy Spirit highlights and asks you to be about, let's just say from the Sermon on the Mount, the act, the obedience of turning the other cheek when someone says something against you or literally hits you. If all day you set your face to turn that cheek, to not have a harsh word, to not flip that guy the bird in traffic who just cut you off, if you go about that as entirely your focus for one day, I guarantee you that you actually have had a spiritual impact upon those rats in the cellar of your temperament. Can we completely change ourselves? Absolutely not. That's the human idea of perfectibility, that we can become so perfect, or even in the holiness movement with friends like Andrew Murray, who I do love. They had this idea that they were going to actually make themselves holy. I don't necessarily think that's the case, even based on Pauline theology. But can we have an impact by following Jesus incrementally? I do believe we can. We can actually change the way that we react. We can change those impulsive behaviors when someone does something to us. So let's not give up, friends. We're not fixing ourselves, but we are following a demonstrable way. It's the way of Jesus. It's the way he's asked us to act. All right, here comes the second discovery that he offers us. 2. I have been talking as if it were we who did everything. In reality, of course, it is God who does everything. We, at most, allow it to be done to us. In a sense, you might even say it is God who does the pretending. The three-personal God, so to speak, sees before him, in fact, a self-centered, greedy, grumbling, rebellious human animal. But he says, let us pretend that this is not a mere creature, but our Son. It is like Christ insofar as it is a man, for he became a man. Let us pretend that it is also like him in spirit. Let us treat it as if it were what in fact it is not. Let us pretend in order to make the pretense into a reality. God looks at you as if you were a little Christ. Christ stands beside you to turn you into one. I dare say, this idea of a divine make-believe sounds rather strange at first. But is it so strange, really? Is not that how the higher thing always raises the lower? A mother teaches her baby to talk by talking to it as if it understood long before it really does. We treat our dogs as if they were almost human. That is why they really become almost human in the end. Friends, if I could leave you with one thing in this particular episode, it's the fact that not only in Paul's words, but also in the Gospels, we are offered the picture, which according to Lewis is almost like playing pretend, of you and I being already, because of the cross, holy, blameless, and because of the resurrection, timeless, eternal, just like Jesus. So what if we go into this day, or reconvene with the day if you've taken a break in the middle, and actually believe that we are like him, holy, blameless, one with the Father, actually empowered with the royalty that was Jesus's, and that we can treat everyone around us, especially those who don't know him, with the kind of love, honor, and respect that Jesus treated everyone with. And what if you and I stop measuring our life by the daily measurements of time, money, the house we live in, the car we have, and started thinking of ourselves as those who are immortal, who will be around forever and ever, who can have as much of the presence of God today as we will in fact someday have when we're on the other side? What if we live that way? What if we treat others as that kind of life calls up from us? Friends, let's do it. Let's put on that likeness. Let's be those little Christs, those Christians, as those believers in Antioch were first called, and let's go live it so that others are attracted to it. Thanks for joining me. We have been, to remind you, in Book 4, that was Chapter 7, in C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity. I'm so grateful that you keep joining me on these episodes, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.